In a previous video, I have presented the most common arguments used by skeptics to debunk astrology, and I have explained why each and every one of them was at least partially true. In this video, I will show you that the idea that they somehow debunk astrology is utter bullshit. Let's start with the first claim that the fact that astrology doesn't work is common sense, or that astrology makes no sense. Well, by the same logic, you should debunk quantum physics, because most of its claims make far less sense than a lunatic in an insane asylum, but they still are true. On the other hand, the common sense argument is quite effective if you are trying to defend the flat earth theory, because, common sense dictates that the earth is flat. Now, the second argument about the zodiac signs being wrong is far more interesting, because not only are they wrong today, they were wrong when they were invented, and it was deliberate. You see, the whole idea wasn't about conforming 30-degree segments of the sky to the constellations. It was about conforming the constellations to the lunar and solar cycles, to the months in a year. In fact, prior to that point, astrology had far more constellations to take into account, but since it wasn't conforming to the solar and lunar cycles, it was impossible to, not impossible, but very hard to conform to the calendar. So the 12-sign zodiac was actually the solution to simple chronology. Now, the third argument is also quite interesting, because it is true that we cannot track the moment of conception for most individuals. However, even if we look at it from the standpoint of simple biology, the moment at which someone becomes an independent organism is the moment when the umbilical cord is cut. As such, that would be the most effective moment to start tracking someone's life as independent, and that is exactly the method you will see astrologers utilize today. Now, the fourth argument, that no one knows how astrology works, well, that one is quite stupid. I mean, by the same token, you can debunk gravity, you can debunk consciousness, you can debunk most of science itself, because in many cases we don't know how things work, yet they still work. Now, the fifth argument about science showing that astrology is unreliable, or showing that it doesn't work, is outdated at best, and at worst quite misleading. You see, there are studies that corroborate the claims of astrology, at least partially. You will find a link below to another video I have made on the subject, and in its description you will find links to studies that support some of the claims made by astrology. Now, as for the claim that astrology is at odds with the scientific method, or with modern philosophy, well, there is some validity to that. But again, the subject itself is quite broad, and it is very hard to address because of its scope. Now, there are schools of astrology which are more spiritual or New Age in approach, and others that present certain, imaginary things as facts, let's just say that. But these are far from the standard, and there are quite a few schools of astrology which do operate based on the scientific method and do check all of their facts. The most prominent example would be the Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan school in India, founded by K.N. Rao. There is one more thing I wish to address. Let's be honest, the biggest elephant in the room when it comes to astrology and science is the question of causality. What I mean by that is the idea of the stars influencing our lives. Well, as far as I can tell, this premise is rather new, because if you would ask the ancient Mesopotamians, they would say, no, the stars are just omens. But with the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, etc., the idea became entrenched because you needed some mechanism to explain why astrology should work. Quite unfortunately, it is the best evidence you have against astrology, because there is no scientific validity to any claim for causality. But in reality, you don't really need the causality to be there in the first place for astrology to work. In fact, when was the last time you saw an astrologer looking through a telescope? That simply doesn't happen, because astrologers don't actually use the stars as guides. They use mathematical charts. The whole idea of a birth chart, a horoscope, they are mathematically calculated. They're not even exact snapshots of the sky. They are simply abstracts which correlate to the movement of the planets. Now, this is far from trivial, because if we look at astrology as a series of calculations, as a mathematical discipline, instead of as a observable discipline, as a natural science like biology, the whole picture becomes quite different. Now, let's be clear. There will be astrologers that will continue to claim that causality exists, but to say that causality is a fundamental requirement of astrology, well, that's simply not true. Now, as for the claim that astrologers defend astrology to protect their vested interest, well, that would be true about basically any profession, and also about science, because even if your vested interest is simply to avoid religious dogma, it is still a vested interest. Now, as for the claim that astrology is not a science, astrology is in fact quite a few things combined into one single concept. For example, astrology is simultaneously a form of spiritual practice, a form of philosophy, and a methodology, be it a scientific one or not. In addition, it is not very prudent to say that if astrology is not a science, it is invalid, because philosophy is also not a science. And as for the claim that astrology was just invented, well, that would be true about every single scientific discipline out there. You see, you wouldn't need a scientific discipline if its premises were self-evident. You would simply need to look around. In addition, the idea that something was just invented does not negate either its premise or its usefulness. For example, art was just invented. Does that make it any less valid or any less useful? So as you can see, these arguments prove very little, if anything, other than the ignorance shown by those who make them. In fact, they are a perfect example of the application of Newton's response to Halley. I have studied the subject. You, sir, have not. And perhaps that is the biggest problem, because if you haven't studied the subject, well, you would make such arguments instead of looking at, is the subject actually worth your time? I hope you have enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe. And if you wish to learn more about astrology, please visit my website. You will find the link below. Thank you.